Okay, well, there's still quite a lot that needs to be said about thesis statements, and I'm going to look in a little bit more detail today, giving you some examples of thesis statements and supporting arguments, trying to see what kind of thing would work and what kind of thing wouldn't work. If you're going to write a good thesis statement, let's just go back over some of the things that I talked about before. First thing would be, don't rush in and try to decide your thesis statement straight away. Read around the topic and take your time to find out what other people are saying and think about your reactions to what they say and build your thesis statement up around that. Second thing would be to be flexible. All right, don't be afraid if you are working on your thesis and you change your mind about the actual thesis statement, you change your position as you're working, don't be afraid to change your thesis statement. The next thing would be to keep your topic very, very focused and to make sure that you're writing about something specific, something debatable, something that can be discussed in depth in the space available. So it's going to be something very, very specific. And here are some examples. All right, let's take a look and see what kinds of things I've been getting from students recently. Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. And in Shakespeare's play, Shylock, obviously very famous as a Jewish character, and the thesis was this. Shylock is a Jew, but his main function is to satirize the greed and hypocrisy of Puritans. All right, so that's the thesis, and the arguments are as follows, that there were very few, almost no Jews living in England at this time, and that Shakespeare's using the character not to show people Jewish characters who would have been very unfamiliar to them, but to symbolize something else. All right? And the next one, the next argument, is that Puritans were famous for their insistence on contracts and for their money-lending activities, which is precisely what Shylock is standing out for in that play. And finally, that Shakespeare might have got into some trouble if he'd attacked Puritans directly, so he attacks them in an indirect way. All right. Would I consider it then to be a good argument? Well, yes, I would. I would because, firstly, it's a narrow enough topic to be arguable in depth in the space available. Secondly, I like it because it's something that scholars have been debating. There is an ongoing debate about this possibility that Shakespeare is using Shylock to make a kind of veiled attack on Puritans. So there's a lot for the student to research and a lot of material that the student can draw on to use in the paper. I like the fact that the student gives strong supporting arguments and builds on a variety of sources, not just using one source, obviously, but looking at different academic papers and looking closely at the text and giving a very well-constructed argument. I also like the fact that the student shows a good understanding of the text that Shakespeare wrote and of the social and cultural context in which it was written, and has researched the topic in quite a lot of detail. So basically, yes, I thought that was a good argument, well put together. Let's take a look at another one. By Shakespeare, Ophelia, in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And the thesis here was, the portrayal of Ophelia is an indication that Shakespeare had Catholic sympathies, with the following supporting arguments. Firstly, Ophelia is a pure and innocent woman, and this recalls the Virgin Mary, who's a powerful symbol of Catholic doctrine. All right, so Ophelia is pure and innocent, and the Virgin Mary is too. Secondly, her death is a matter of destiny, and it reflects the fate of the Catholic Church in England at that time, which in a sense died because of the Reformation, and Catholics were not allowed to practice their religion, and so on. All right, so that's the second argument. And the third argument, that Ophelia's funeral service and her burial are conducted in the Catholic manner. All right, so again, is it a good argument? Well, frankly, I felt it was okay, but I'm not altogether happy. It's got a lot of things similar to the previous topic. It focuses on one character, and so it's narrow enough to be argued in some depth. But the basic problem I have with it is the supporting arguments. They're not really very persuasive. And I felt that there are some very good arguments against those supporting arguments, but the student just doesn't mention them. Is that because the student didn't do the research? I'm inclined to think that that's the problem, that the student has only read the argument in support of the thesis and doesn't know what the arguments on the other side of the debate are. And I think quite a lot of the time the student's summarising mostly from one source. So basically the paper needed more research. Let's take a look at that in a little bit more detail. Take a look at the supporting arguments here. Ophelia is a pure and innocent woman, and that recalls the Virgin Mary, a powerful symbol of Catholic doctrine. All right, so that's the first argument. Well, true enough, but also it has to be said that there are lots of pure and innocent women in literature, and they can't all be connected to the Virgin Mary, can they? So just by itself, that to me is not a very persuasive argument. Second argument, that her death is a matter of destiny, reflecting the fate of the Catholic Church in England at that time. Well, I have the same problem with that. There are plenty of people who die in works of literature. They're not all connected with the fate of the Catholic Church, are they? What would make this different? Why, in this case, would we say that Ophelia's death is connected to the Catholic Church and that she is connected to the Virgin Mary? Why wouldn't we say that about all pure women who die in works of literature? It doesn't altogether make sense to me. And the third argument was, I think, the weakest of them all, saying that her funeral service and her burial are conducted in the Catholic manner. Well, yes, they are. Of course they are. This is because the play was set in Denmark at a time before the Reformation, when all of Europe was Catholic. So there were no Protestant services. There was no Protestant church service. There was no Protestant funeral or burial. Everything was Catholic because the whole of Europe was Catholic at that time. So number 3 just seems pretty obvious that of course it's going to be in the Catholic manner, because at that time in Denmark, in the time that the play is set, there was nothing else. So altogether I felt that the thesis could have been okay, but just wasn't really backed up properly. A good thesis comes from good research. I don't find those arguments to be very persuasive, and the student doesn't show a wide knowledge of the subject. The student doesn't give much analysis of the text, so I wonder whether the student really knows the text in very much detail. And although there's nothing wrong with the actual structure of the paper, it needed a more persuasive argument in order to be a good piece of work. If there'd been more research, if there'd been a detailed knowledge of Shakespeare's play and so on, then yes, I might have valued that more. But the way the paper is actually presented, everything coming from mostly from one source and some from a second source, one or two sources, with no sense that there is an opposite side to the argument, I felt that, well, I wouldn't fail this paper, but I couldn't give it a good grade. Okay? All right, let's look at another one. Colour in Jane Eyre, and the thesis here is that Brontë uses colour to symbolise Jane's emotional growth and development, with the following supporting arguments. The first one being based on the colour red, and saying that it's frequently used to symbolise passion and danger, as in the Red Room or fire or something like that. Second being the colour blue, which is used to symbolise attractive things like blue skies and serenity, calm, as in blue skies. And the third argument being that Jane herself is dressed in drab colours most of the time during the story, but at the very end she's wearing a pale blue dress. This one. Well, yes, on the whole, I thought that was a good thesis too. And my reasons were basically because the student had noticed this about colour herself, basically. And, well, using the Gutenberg online text is a fairly obvious use of modern technology to approach literature, but it does make it possible to do word searches and to find out how the text is working at a bigger level. And so I thought that was quite well done. And because people talk often about the red room and the symbolism of the colour red, I was possibly a little bit worried that the student would not talk about other colours, but the way that the text makes this transition from red through to blue, and Jane herself is basically grey most of the way through. I liked that, and I also liked the way that the student researched the topic. Obviously, in every case, that's going to be very important, the way that it's researched and the use of academic papers and criticism and so on. And in fact, I thought it could have been a longer paper, that there was actually more material there that could have been developed to look more extensively at colours and perhaps at other colours in the course of the telling of Jane Eyre. So let's take a look now at some of the longer papers and see what makes a successful 3,000 word paper. Many of these could probably have been done as 1,000 word papers, but giving that extra length to a paper does mean you can go more into detail. Okay, so this paper is on animals in Dickens's David Copperfield. So in a way similar to the Jane Eyre one, which is about colour, showing the development of Jane. This shows animals and their relationship to David's growth during the story, with supporting arguments being that dogs are particularly used as a sign of warning of danger, and that they show hostility to David. Both Mr. Murdstone's dog and Dora's dog, they both show that David is going to have to face some dangers or difficulties, so that they're used in a systematic way. And the crocodile, which recurs through the story, comes in particularly at the beginning and the end, and its relationship on the one hand to Mr. Murdstone and on the other to Peggotty, who helps him as a little boy. She reads the story, they read the story of the crocodile together, and that book is still in her apron pocket at the end of the story. And donkeys being the third argument, or the third example of the argument, in particular the donkey that the Murdstones arrive with, and showing Betsy providing a safe haven for David by driving out the donkeys, and that there's a sort of symbolism going on there. Was it a good argument then? And well, yes, I think again, on the whole, it was a good argument. I was a bit worried about it when the student first discussed it, because it could have ended up as a list of David's encounters with the animals as he grows up. But the student, by focusing on these three animals and showing that there's a pattern in the way that he relates the animals to David's situation, I thought the student did a good job there. And I liked the research that went to back it up, together with the close analysis of the novel, so that it shows awareness of the novel in detail, and it shows the psychology and symbolism, as well as other people who are commenting on animals in Dickens. It shows general research into the psychology and symbolism of animals. So it was a well-researched paper, and being a longer paper, it can introduce more detail. And for example, in the introduction, in this case, the student was talking about changing attitudes towards animals in Victorian England, which was useful background information to help understand why Dickens might have given that kind of status to animals in his work. Okay, so let's look at one more. This one is Capitalism in Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. The thesis being that Dickens shows that personal relationships, social welfare and education are more important than money, with the following supporting arguments. The first one being that Scrooge symbolises the evils of a society, a materialist society, one that cares only about money and doesn't care about human qualities like kindness and compassion. The second argument being that Jacob Marley and the ghost of Jacob Marley, that is, and the three Christmas spirits and the two children, ignorance and want, challenge Scrooge's capitalist way of thinking. And the third argument is that this anti-capitalist message is echoed in other works by Charles Dickens, and that he's consistently showing that human relationships and education and social welfare programs are more important than just money. Is it a good argument? Well, it's not that good in the sense that, well, it's fairly obvious, really. There's hardly anybody who's read A Christmas Carol who would say, no, it doesn't attack capitalist greed, no, it doesn't promote human relationships or education and social welfare. And in that sense, it's not a very good thesis because there's nobody likely to disagree with it. It's not really, therefore, a topic for debate. On the other hand, even if you've got a weak or a fairly weak thesis like this, if it's well researched and well presented, then you could end up with a reasonably good paper. And in this case, I think the student did, because there was a lot of background work on Victorian capitalism, relating the book to political developments like the Corn Laws or the New Poor Law, and the theories of population that Malthus had been putting forward at the end of the previous century. And making the important point too that although Dickens is against capitalism, his opposition is very different from that of Karl Marx. And so showing a good knowledge of Dickens's work and a good knowledge of the background, the historical and social background of the period. So even though the argument is rather obvious, the paper did get a good grade because there was a lot of detailed research, and the presentation was very thorough. So all of this is pointing us in the direction that a good thesis is very important, but it's just part of what makes a good paper. It's just as important to have a good research base and present a persuasive argument to back up the thesis. And without this, even a good thesis won't lead to a good grade. So if the research is good and the argument is well presented, then even a paper that has a thesis that's not particularly good can get a good grade, within limits, as we shall see. All of the examples we've looked at so far are arguing about something specific. They're not trying to cover huge topics. They're focusing narrowly on a particular topic. And so all of these could be used as a thesis, and it would depend on the way that the student did it, whether the student backed it up with research and presented the argument in a logical kind of way. There are cases, though, when students just choose the wrong kind of thesis that could actually mess up the whole paper. The most problematic type of thesis statement is something that I'm going to look at on the next slide here. And that's the thesis statement that actually isn't a thesis statement at all. Okay, this is really a problem when a student says something like, Jane Eyre works as a governess at Thornfield Hall, so I'll show the life of governesses in Victorian England, just as an example. There's no argument here. There's no thesis. It just isn't a thesis. And something like this is really going to guarantee that the paper's going to fail. I mean, pretty much. There could be ways of it would depend to some extent on how the student wrote the paper, but it's going to be quite difficult if the paper does what that thesis statement says, well, that non-thesis statement says, then it's likely to fail. Firstly, because, as I say, it isn't a thesis statement. It's not arguable. The paper can't develop the argument about showing the life of governesses. There isn't an argument in there. All right, there's no evidence cannot be presented to show that the argument is correct or incorrect because there's nothing to argue here. It's just a description. And in this age of information, well, we can get descriptions of the life of governesses from dozens of blog sites, dozens of websites, Wikipedia, and so on. It's just not, there's no point in a paper like that. Particularly for students of literature, this would be absolutely the wrong kind of topic. It just has nothing to do with literature. I mean, the student could bring it back to Jane Eyre and talk about the life of governesses and make reference to Jane Eyre. That would save things a little bit, but it's not really in itself a literature topic. If it was a history class or a class on culture, well, then it would be a bit different. But even then, you'd expect some kind of argument. You'd expect, for example, the student to say what the main function of a governess was. All right, arguing that a governess was basically a status symbol, not necessarily there to provide an education. Okay, that would at least be an argument. But what we've got at the moment is not connected with literature, and it's not even an argument. Another problem would be a thesis statement that just can't really be proved at all. I mean, all right, the thesis statement has to be debatable, but when we have something as vague as Jane Eyre is a feminist novel, well, the proof would depend on what we mean by feminist. So it's not a disaster in the same way as the last one, but there are a lot of problems with this because how are we going to define the word feminism? There are different kinds of feminism, what they call first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. So depending on how we define the term feminism, we could say that it is a feminist novel, or we could say it's not. We could say it is a feminist novel because it argues that women feel just as deeply as men and have minds that are as good as men's minds. Or we could say, oh no, it's not feminist because at the end Jane marries. But that would be a different idea of feminism. And so the answer to the question would depend on what we mean by the word feminism. So it's a rather unsatisfactory way of writing a paper, especially given the fact that the word feminism didn't actually exist at the time that Jane Eyre was written. So your thesis statement should not depend on how you define your terms in that kind of way. If the word feminist had a clear meaning and we could all agree about it, well, we could all argue whether it was or wasn't a feminist novel, but then it probably would be something that wasn't going to be very debatable anyway. But in this case, the word feminism means so many different things to different people, we can't really say whether it applies to the novel. And also, we could say, well, it might apply to parts of the novel. There are times when Jane clearly is challenging the superiority of men, and there are times when she's accepting the traditional role of a woman. So what does that, how does it help us to say that it is or isn't a feminist novel? It doesn't really take us anywhere. So there are problems with that approach. If we made it more specific and said that Jane Eyre is feminist in a particular sense, in a particular way, in the sense that the author makes a plea for the right of women to an equal education, that might at least show that what we mean when we say feminism in that context. And so it would give us something concrete that we could argue about. So not a disaster in the same way as the previous example, which really messes up the whole paper, but still quite a lot of problems attached to simply saying that it is or is not a feminist novel. It's just a fact. All right. So we've already seen something like that, which in the end didn't lead to a very, very bad paper. It was quite a good paper, actually, because of the research done on it. But the paper on A Christmas Carol, showing that money is less important than human relationships and social welfare and education, well, as I said at the time, almost no one would disagree with it. And I get a lot of papers of that kind where the thesis is not a thesis, it's a fact. It's something that everybody just says, well, yes, that's true. And so students take a fact like the Puritan Revolution and say, I will give reasons for why it happened. The growth of the British Empire, I will explain how it happened. So it's not really an argument, it's an explanation. It's not arguing for a particular theory or thesis, it's explaining a particular fact. And so the whole argument, the whole paper becomes not an argument, but an explanation of fact. Wind up. You can see that the thesis statement is a complicated thing, and that finding the right thesis statement could take a lot of time and a lot of thought. And so this is why I'm asking students to email me, to talk directly to me about their thesis and about their paper and their research and get advice from me. Each paper is going to need a different kind of advice. Each student is working on something a little bit different. So these general guidelines will only help up to a point. There's going to be a time when you need more exact guidance related particularly to your paper. So that's why I ask students to stay in contact with me about their paper. And some people do. They send drafts. This is my draft introduction, first version. This is a summary of my ideas, or they send a draft of the whole paper. Other people come to my office asking questions, and then you get those people who just don't do anything. They don't contact me, and they just submit a paper at the end. Well, it's the ones who don't contact me, or who really contact me very little, who very often end up getting bad grades. And it's really up to you to write the paper, and it's up to me to show you how to write it. But if you don't keep in touch with me, I can't do my job. And that means that it's going to be more difficult for you to do your job. It's going to be more difficult for you to write a good paper. So take all the information, all the ideas, all the guidelines that I'm giving you here, but don't think that that is everything. It's also important to keep in touch with the teacher over the topic. Okay.